let me explain something to you. I wrote about a couple hundred songs, you know? I've got them all written down and all that, man. All right, I'll give you an example, man. I'll try to stick to a song that'll make you some money. Let's see.
The mythology of Charlie Manson has come to mean, above all else, vicious murder. But those terrible acts were never what he was aiming for. The real story of Charlie Manson is music.
I don't think Charlie could have been Charlie without the music. He was a poet, and he really believed in his music.
Music was the vehicle. He really wanted to spread his philosophy. To me, that seemed to be the most important and overriding agenda.
In 1968, cult leader and singer-songwriter Charles Manson gained access to the top tier of the Los Angeles music world. Only a year later, he was accused of being the most dangerous man alive.
It might not be as obvious to some people how involved and ingrained in the music business Charles Manson seemed to be. Terry Melcher is producing the Byrds, Beach Boys, Brian Wilson. These are two huge selling record producers, and they're looking at you, Charles Manson.
It could never have happened before or after. It really was a perfect storm, that period of time. When somebody like Charlie could walk into the scene, there was no cap, there was no limit, there were no rules.
This film tells the story of Manson's musical dream and how it all fell apart.
The story of Charles Manson is a story of rejection and collapse. It was a disintegration of Manson's dreams, and it allowed the madness to rise.
Los Angeles, August 9th, 1969. At the tail end of one of the most tumultuous decades in American history, the city's residents awakened to the news of a brutal multiple homicide in the very heart of Tinseltown.
In a crime scene that police say resembled a ritualistic mass murder, 5 persons, including the actress Sharon Tate, were found slain at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski. Miss Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, and the other victims were discovered dead this morning at the Hilltop Estate in Benedict Canyon. Most had suffered multiple stab wounds, while one had been shot at close range.
Murders in Los Angeles are a regrettable formality. They happen in California, they happen in America, especially where gun crime and knife crime is prevalent. But this was out of that league. This was Premier League horror. We are talking about the slaughter of an 8.5-month pregnant woman, and also the murders of those present with such violence inflicted on them which appeared to have no bounds. This was something else. This was absolutely shocking.
The fact that one of the victims was a Hollywood star and the wife of a famous film director saw the story hit the headlines worldwide. The following day, 2 more murders were discovered less than 15 miles away. Again, the targets of a savage home invasion, and this second attack sent further shockwaves through the local community.
From the beginning, stories would allude to the savagery, the brutality of what was done, and some facts got in the newspaper. Within a few days, you could not buy a gun in Los Angeles anymore. The stores, the shelves were bare. Guard dogs that sold for $100 before the murder were going for as much as $2,000.
It would take months for the police to apprehend the culprits, and when the arrests were eventually reported, the world was stunned. Charles Manson, the head of a hippie commune, and a number of his wide-eyed, mostly female followers were charged with some of the most violent murders in American history. Only 2 years beforehand, California had been the epicenter of the Summer of Love, where the flourishing counterculture celebrated peace and understanding. But this younger generation had always been viewed with skepticism by conservative Americans. And over time, as the movement became more radical, it also became more threatening. Through Manson and his band of murderous flower children, that potential threat had now become a reality.
The average American looking at the coverage of the Manson case, they didn't feel any identification whatsoever with, Sharon Tate or these other families in Hollywood. What they felt was these kids are totally out of control. They experienced it as indistinguishable from campus rebellions and, the riots in Chicago and protests. And from the standpoint of, the so-called silent majority, it was a sense of, these spoiled kids. All they want to do is this rebel rousing and take drugs and have sex. And then you bundle all that up into the worst possible version of it. And there's the Manson murders.
But the case was also baffling, and the motives for the murders remained unclear. Although the press were quick to run stories of drug-fueled orgies and satanic rituals, as the district attorney and the police probed deeper into the testimonies of those involved, a complex story emerged. Manson was not simply the isolated cult leader, nor the cold-blooded career criminal that his profile suggested. He was also a singer-songwriter, with connections at the very top of the LA music scene.
About early December of 1969, the first stories started to appear in the Los Angeles newspapers that Manson may have committed this crime as trying to either kill or get even with Terry Melcher, who's the son of actress Doris Day. To young America, Terry Melcher was a famous name because of his work with the Byrds, with Paul Revere and the Raiders. To middle America, he was the son of America's sweetheart. But as the investigation would continue, the stories started appearing in the papers, a name at a time. Terry Melcher, certainly, Greg Jacobson, who was part of the music scene, but other names too, Dennis Wilson, Neil Young, John Phillips, Buffy St. Marie. It became apparent early on that music was a big part of whatever it was that made up Charlie Manson.
And Manson's musical journey began here, San Francisco, 1967, a city at the heart of a cultural revolution. Since the end of the Second World War, it had emerged as a beacon for those looking to escape the conservatism of Middle America and explore alternative lifestyles and attitudes. And it became the West Coast stomping ground for the writers of the Beat generation. But it was in the mid-1960s that the city fully blossomed as a hub of creativity, its youth fueled by new music, new drugs, and new ideas. And the nerve center for this cultural and artistic activity was the Haight-Ashbury district.
Haight-Ashbury in 1967, in part it's a little bit of an accident. The beat scene had been located in North Beach, but there's a new availability of housing, and cheap housing. San Francisco State University students start moving in, and then the artists come, and they create a very, it's small, but it's very vital, collaborative, cooperative, do-it-yourself art scene. The musicians are a big part of that. The Grateful Dead are there at 710 Ashbury. Janis Joplin lives there. Jefferson Airplane is the first big band to hit it there. And when you put all of those creative people together, they start feeding off of each other's energy. I think the big picture is the fight for personal, artistic, and sexual freedom. There was something going on here that was pushing for expanded freedoms across many dimensions.
Although in the mid-1960s, the city's crusade for expanded freedoms was not unique, the driving force behind its particular vision of freedom was. While a vibrant youth culture had been thriving in cities across Europe and America since the emergence of the Beatles at the start of the decade, no other scene had access to the Haight-Ashbury's drug of choice, LSD. This powerful hallucinogen was at the very center of the San Francisco experience, informing the music, art, and ideas that were emerging from the city. Where other drugs affected mood, with LSD, a user's perception of reality was significantly altered, and after only one trip, many felt they had undergone a spiritual awakening.
It can't be overstated the power of LSD. It literally elevated people from one place to somewhere completely different and transformed people's lives overnight.
Everybody was seeking this enlightenment, but LSD was kind of a shortcut. You know, it kind of opened up the top of your head and let you see, or at least think you saw, you know, this other way of life. But it also made us all very vulnerable to people taking advantage.
And as the San Francisco counterculture began to attract both national and international recognition at the start of 1967, it was the psychologist Timothy Leary who emerged as the most prominent advocate of LSD, publicly promoting both its therapeutic and spiritual benefits.
There was a lot of talk about expanded consciousness, you know, and sometimes that took on very strong spiritual dimensions in the way people talked about LSD and its uses. Leary was the new face of that story.
Tim Leary was a Harvard professor who essentially became the apostle of LSD. His background gave a patina of a kind of authority, I suppose, to his ideas about LSD and the, you know, new world, the kind of utopia that it was going to introduce.
The message is very simple. 6 words. Turn on, tune in, drop out.
His slogan became, you know, turn on, tune in, drop out. Get high, you know, marijuana, LSD, you know, tune in, connect with, you know, the kind of images, ideas, visions that those drugs bring to you, and then drop out of the society. There was a sense that utopia is just in the offing. That was the idea, that paradise could be regained, and LSD was the path to it.
The dropout part of his message was the most controversial. Later, he would walk that statement back a little bit. He didn't mean drop out. He meant, you know, think harder about where you put your energy. But, you know, the pebble had been dropped in that water, and it started rippling out in ways that nobody could finally control, least of all Timothy Leary.
And in the summer of 1967, the so-called Summer of Love, young, disenchanted people from across America began dropping out en masse and flocked to San Francisco, searching for the utopia that Timothy Leary's vision suggested was waiting for them.
One of the things we forget is that Haight-Ashbury was such a concentrated place. It could perhaps have handled maybe 1,000 people living there, eating there, part of a community. But during the so-called Summer of Love, from 67 through 69, the estimate is to this day that about 300 kids a day would show up. And these were the ones who had no money, they had no place to go, just the belief if you get there will be taken care of. That is the atmosphere. It opened up the possibility for predators. From around the country came hustlers, came the dope dealers, came the pimps, and above all, attracted by this wonderful hunting ground, came Charlie Manson.
You going to mug me? I'm not going to mug you.
Is that gorgeous or what, eh?
And I believe I can run a decent marathon.
Thank you very much.
Download Veely now.
First arriving in the Haight-Ashbury district in the spring of 1967, Charles Manson was 32 years old and just as keen to engage with the utopia on offer as the youth surrounding him. Freshly released from a 7-year stretch in prison, like many of those flocking to San Francisco, Manson too was looking to escape a troubled past and to make a fresh start in this brave new world. Born in Cincinnati, Ohio, to an unmarried teenager, Kathleen Maddox, a wayward mother at odds with her religious family, young Charlie Manson never knew his father. And at the age of only 4, he watched his mother being led away by police for armed robbery, for which she would receive a 5-year jail sentence.
Manson was every part the throwaway kid. He was passed to friends, to family, to anyone who would take him. He was then sent to his grandparents and then on to his aunt and uncle, So basically he was passed around, and from an early age he knew he wasn't wanted.
He lived with his aunt, uncle, and cousin, and his grandmother came to see him. There was no reason to say that Charlie's early life as a child was ideal. Having your mother in prison never is. But he always had loving people who cared about him. The problem was, of course, that Charlie was, from the beginning, a very disagreeable, violent child.
But although aggressive and sullen, in his aunt and uncle's household in West Virginia, the young Charles Manson also found a less destructive outlet for his energies.
There was a piano in his uncle and aunt's house, and even as a tiny child, and you need to remember, we're talking about a boy who even at 5 years old looked perhaps 3. His hands were tiny, but he would stay on the keyboard and by ear pick out songs. The songs in his life at the time came from one of 2 categories, church music or country music. He was something of a musical prodigy. He hated going to church except singing, and when he would sing, he would join in so wholeheartedly that his grandmother would believe the Spirit of the Lord must be descending on this child.
This natural gift for music was not enough to curb Manson's delinquent tendencies, however. In his teenage years, his criminal activities, including theft and burglary, saw him arrested countless times and detained in a number of reform schools and correctional institutions. And as he gained a criminal education while incarcerated, by his early 20s, his main aspiration was to become a pimp.
Manson was every bit the petty criminal. He couldn't really organise too much, and as his rap sheet concludes, he kept getting caught.
Charlie Manson was a failure as a criminal in every way. He started out shoplifting and always got caught. He would steal cars, they would track him down. Finally, when he decided, after learning the trade from pimps in his first stint in prison, that he would run a string of girls, he could never keep them very long. The thing that carried over from his early criminal career is a tremendous eye for those he can manipulate. Manson would explain his philosophy of attracting first his prostitutes and later his female followers as always find the ones who were bent or cracked but not completely broken.
Despite a brief attempt to settle down in the mid-50s, which saw him return to West Virginia and marry a local waitress, criminal instincts were now ingrained in Manson. At the end of the decade, an attempt to establish himself as a pimp in New Mexico once again led to his arrest, and this time he was incarcerated at the isolated medium-security prison, McNeil Island, on a 10-year sentence. With no chance of escape, he learned to play the guitar, and his passion for music returned. It was at first only a pastime, and then in 1964, through the radio, he heard a sound that would change his outlook entirely.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you something I think you'll understand when I say that something I wanna hold your hand.
The Beatles' music was extraordinary. It was vibrant, it was alert. It just swept up the youth of the world. And everyone who came across them was affected. Even if they disliked them, they were still affected by them.
It's impossible to overestimate the Beatles' impact on aspiring musicians, you know, Charles Manson among them, but everybody, anybody from that generation talks about the Beatles and the immediate kind of effect. It was huge, and it was instantaneous, and it was lasting.
It was a transformative moment in his life hearing that music. What the Beatles do for Charlie Manson is they not only expand his musical horizons, but they expand his ambition. Previously, all he wants to be is a successful pimp, where women go out and do all the work for you and you don't have to work very hard yourself. Now, suddenly, he's got a guitar, he knows how to play it, he's got the inspiration, and he starts writing songs in prison.
Terminal Island, Los Angeles. It was here in 1966 that Manson was transferred to complete his time in prison, his 10-year stretch reduced due to good behavior. At this low-security prison, Manson met Phil Kaufman, an actor serving a short sentence for drug possession.
We were walking in the yard every day after, between jobs and after dinner and breakfast. You walk in the yard back and forth. And this guy was playing a guitar. And he was singing, "The shadow of your smile." I said, wow, this guy's cool.
The shadow of your
So I walked up to say, we introduced ourselves, and he continued playing his guitar, and we're talking. And a guard comes up to him. He says, "Manson, you can't play your guitar here. You got to play your guitar over there in the music area." Charlie just kept playing his guitar, walked away. And the guard yelled, "Manson, you ain't never going to get out of here." And Charlie said, "Out of where, man?" "The shadow of your smile." Okay, just carried on. Charlie was, he was cool. He played the guitar and he sang music that I liked. He was singing standards. You know, like I said, "The Shadow of Your Smile" and other popular songs at the time. And he sang well. It sounded a lot like Frankie Lane. He was a big star back in the 40s. And Charlie and I are both from that era. We're both older guys, so that was our frame of reference. We had Frank Sinatra, or Perry Como, or that genre.
In March 1967, Manson was up for release from Terminal Island, and aware of his musical ambitions, Phil Kaufman gave him the details of a valuable entertainment contact.
When Charlie was getting out, I suggested he meet a friend of mine, Gary Stromberg, who is in the music business, because I thought he was good. So once again, this is Charlie in prison I'm talking about. And so I'm taking that persona and introducing him to respectable people in the music business. And it turned out just the opposite, you know. Once he got out, you know, he says, game on.
Having been incarcerated since the end of the previous decade, upon his release, Manson was cast into a totally foreign landscape. The America he had known had been transformed by the youth culture revolution that followed in the wake of the Beatles. With the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the advent of the Vietnam War, and the draft that was seeing thousands of young men thrown into a conflict they didn't believe in, the generation gap that had developed in the 1950s had now become a chasm. The counterculture that was spreading across the nation viewed their elders and the authorities with a deep suspicion and was looking to reshape the American way of life.
People realized that we were kind of, as a nation, we were kind of spiritually bankrupt. You know, we'd lost our way. The moral principles of our Constitution and the founding of our founding fathers seemed to be forgotten. This was a time of deep alienation in the country because of the Vietnam War, because of advances in sexual rights and a greater awareness of racial discrimination and the civil rights movement. There was a great division, but I saw it not so much as a negative thing, but one is where we were exploring new things. We were all going through this sort of phases of exploration and innocence, really.
And the 32-year-old Charles Manson was very keen to exploit that innocence. Heading first to Berkeley and then on to San Francisco, the city enabled him to regain a youth lost in confinement, and he embraced this new culture and its liberating power. In Haight-Ashbury, Manson's first impulse was to stand back and observe the leaders of this scene. Over a number of weeks, he listened to the local bands, watched the various preachers and social activists at Golden Gate Park, and took LSD for the first time. Then he headed down the street with his guitar in hand and began looking for followers of his own.
San Francisco was awash with gurus, philosophers, preachers, cults, religions, everything imaginable on every street corner. Manson had his own brand of philosophy. He was known as the gardener. He used to plant seeds in people's minds, you know. So he brought a package with him.
I think he was a very crafty and charismatic person. I mean, he was a great performer and a great preacher. He did have a good act, which was one of cosmic intelligence, which frankly never made sense to me beyond 2 or 3 sentences, but still he had it down.
Melding concepts from the Bible, Scientology, and the acid gurus surrounding him, Manson's philosophy that morality was a lie that nothing was corrupt except for possessions, the ego, and family, began to draw to him a small group of young women. Mary Brunner, Lynette Fromm, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Susan Atkins all were seduced by Manson's charisma, his music, and the closeness he promised them. This small harem of followers would act as Manson's entourage for the next step in his plan. With the phone number of Phil Kaufman's music contact, Gary Stromberg, still to hand, in November 1967, he acquired a large yellow school bus and headed south to the City of Angels, his musical dream still burning bright.
In California in particular, even the San Francisco bands that were big and thought of themselves as sort of the upper echelon, as Frank Zappa said, everybody had to go down to Los Angeles and get their hands dirty. That's where the record companies were. There's the labels, there's the people who could sign you. Manson went to Los Angeles for no purpose other than to become a rock and roll star.
Los Angeles, 1967. A sprawling city powered by its immense entertainment industry. And although it had been the heart of the American film world for decades, its growth as a thriving music capital was a relatively recent phenomenon. At the dawn of the decade, the music industry was predominantly concentrated in New York. Yet in 1961, a band emerged who would help put Los Angeles on the musical map. Amid a West Coast craze for surfing, which produced its own local youth culture and instrumental rock sound, the Beach Boys released a run of hits that brought this culture to national attention. Led by the gifted composer and singer Brian Wilson, with his brothers and cousin in support, the band's unique sound propelled them to the top of the music world and immediately gave California a cultural kudos.
The Beach Boys and the surf music phenomenon out of the West Coast, the waves and the suntans and the girls in the skimpy bikinis and the dancing go-go girls, was something that kids in the Midwest especially were fascinated by. Oh, I can go out to California and be living an endless summer. And even people in the colder East Coast cities saw that as an out, you know, a way out. And people started to head to California in the early part of the 60s. The Beach Boys created that mystique nationally.
They had this sort of California sun surf theme, which for everyone, certainly across America and certainly across the world, it was a fantastic package. You know, and it was a brochure to a lifestyle which many people aspired to. So it was good time music.
Surf music had been around, but it was instrumental music. They never had really good vocals on them or vocals at all on them. All of a sudden, Brian Wilson matches that Chuck Berry surf rock energy with these amazing harmonies. Harmonies that have sort of a jazz element to them almost. There hadn't been anything like that.
And the Beach Boys didn't just bring the allure of California to America's teenagers. In 1964, record companies began opening offices in Los Angeles. And following the impact of the Beatles and the British invasion, music television shows were in high demand and began filming at Hollywood studios. With the industry booming, in LA itself, promoters and A&R men were looking for local bands to thrust into the limelight. Enter the Byrds.
Well, the Byrds changed the West Coast music scene overnight. We had all this record company and record business moving out to Los Angeles in 1964, but the Byrds pretty much defined where the future of music was going to be. They took the Beatles beat and the Beatles kind of harmony sound and then mixed it with Bob Dylan's lyrical profundity.
You had a progression in Los Angeles. Obviously, the Beach Boys were hugely important, in the early 60s, and would continue to be so. But what the Beach Boys represented, by the time the Byrds came along, seemed old school. This fun in the sun and surfing and all this business. This sense of a countercultural vision of a new world, that was kind of inscribed in what the Byrds were doing.
A time of love, a time of hate, a time of war, a time of peace, a time you may embrace.
The Byrds morphed a pop sensibility with a much deeper theme, which really up until the end of 1964, no one else had done in pop. Dylan had done it, but he was still a folk artist. He really hadn't penetrated the higher echelons of pop. We talk about Teen Beat or 16 Magazine. He wasn't featuring in that, but the Byrds were.
The Byrds were definitely something that was more 60s, more modern. They had more of a hippie look. It was pre-hippie, but Crosby wore his cape and McGuinn wore his weird sunglasses, and they looked a little edgy. They had a cool sound. It was just so perfect and right for the time.
And the Byrds' success soon inspired a number of other local bands, including The Doors, Love, and Frank Zappa and his Mothers of Invention. With marijuana more readily available in California than on the East Coast or in Britain, these acts all shared an underground sensibility, a stoned mystique that distinguished them from the pop world. And they developed as part of a blooming scene, its center of activity the half-mile stretch of clubs and restaurants in West Hollywood, known as the Sunset Strip. Here, at venues like the Whiskey A Go-Go, the old Hollywood order was being dismantled and the seeds of the coming hippie movement were being sown.
Oh, it was everything. The Strip was there was the Whiskey, of course, and the Trip, and then there were some lesser clubs up and down the Strip. But the Strip was the heart. It was the Mecca where you went to. That's where you went. You were either one of those people who was hip, smoking grass and stuff. But for those people who weren't into it, oh boy, they were from another planet. You couldn't even talk to them.
On previous days, like the Sunset Strip, when the Trocadero and the Macombo and the original Ciro's, those were exclusive nightclubs where the rich and the Hollywood movie stars went to, and you have pictures of Charlie Chaplin and Marilyn Monroe and all the big names there, but it wasn't really accessible to normal Joe. You'd see these pictures in movie magazines, and that's about it. Now, that group of people had gotten older, they'd started performing in Vegas, and teenagers took over the nightclubs.
There didn't seem to be this separation. The musicians were doing their thing, and the audience was doing their thing, but it was all the same thing. We were getting high, we were tuning into this, this expressway to enlightenment. People were just communing with each other, both mentally, physically, we were in it together.
And it was into this hip new world that Charles Manson and his 4 female followers arrived in late 1967. Immediately arranging a meeting with Phil Kaufman's contact, Gary Stromberg, who was a talent scout for Uni Records, Manson prepared his best work for the audition. And Stromberg was impressed enough to book an hour-long recording session at the illustrious Gold Star Studios, the venue from which producers Phil Spector and the Beach Boys' Brian Wilson had recorded their most famous work.
The first recording session that we know of with Charles Manson is for Universal Records subsidiary Uni Records. The tape remarkably exists. It's unedited, which is unusual. And it presents a raw, untutored busker previewing 20-odd songs with no guidance, form, or structure whatsoever.
Hi, Charlie, baby. Okay. Let's see.
Do whatever you feel like, man.
Yeah.
Just groove, Tell us when you're going to start and we'll turn the machine on.
Okay. Well, can't you just turn it on and let it go?
Okay, we're going to let it go right now.
Take out what you want and the rest throw it away.
First of all, I was sort of startled by Manson's voice. It seemed different than the voice that he had when we talked to him, which must have been a year or two later in prison. He was more playful. He giggled a lot, and he seemed nervous.
I'm nervous. If I can make myself nervous, I should be able to make myself unnervous. And it makes sense that it works both ways there.
He seems younger than he is at the time. You know, he's in his mid-30s, and he really seems like, you know, he's like in his early 20s maybe when you listen to him. But he's also nervous as hell. And, you know, the kind of command, you know, if someone were to say to you, well, this guy is going to be like, you know, set-aside murderer and all the other stuff, but cult leader, you know, just going to be commanding people and causing them to do whatever he wants them to do, that just seems absurd. He's got like ideas for songs. He's got little sketches in his mind, and, you know, some of them really have potential. You know, they seem like they could become something.
Your home is where you're happy. It's not where you're not free. Your home is where you can be what you are, 'cause you were just born to be. You can have a castle and diamonds for all to see, but you'll never have that peace of mind until you've learned to be free. So burn.
Your home is where you're happy. It's a fascinating piece of work. That was very attractive to young people with no visible home, or no visible background, or no visible structure, or something they've been alienated from, because they knew their home wasn't happy. They knew they weren't free at home. So they could buy into Manson's utopian world through the song.
Would you mind if I approach you with this song? May I tell you that I watched you, how very long that I've watched you from afar, and now right here you are, so close to me. Now I know it isn't proper.
There's a Latin influence in his stuff, there's a jazz influence in his stuff. I was very surprised to hear actually the smoothness of some of the arrangements, or potentially these arrangements had a smoothness to them that just I would never have guessed that would have been coming out of Charlie.
The sessions didn't convince Uni Records that Manson was ready for a recording contract. Taking the rejection in his stride, he and his family looked for accommodation and found temporary lodging at a communal house a short walk from Topanga Beach, known as the Spiral Staircase. Sharing the property with various drifters, drug addicts and dropouts, Manson and the girls settled into a communal life. And while he spent time working on his music, Manson also used the opportunity to search for new recruits. In December 1967, 14-year-old dropout Diane Lake attended a party at the Spiral Staircase house and became easy prey for an ex-convict who was twice her age.
Charlie comes up, gives me shares his root beer with me, which was apparently really an honor, and invites me to come and, sit in the circle and sing with them. Because he was playing the guitar and the girls were all surrounding him, and they all, came up and, hugged me and, made me feel really, really welcome. Later, Charlie took me under his wing and under his spell, and he seduced me. He was funny. He was kind of impish, childlike, playful. He'd shake his head and his hair would kind of, dance around a little. I mean, I was attracted to him. I thought he was good looking.
Instantly welcomed by the other girls in Manson's troupe, young Diane quickly fell in with the group's rituals of hallucinogens and music, learning every word to Charlie's songs and joining them in their communal performances.
I think we took acid at least once a week. We'd sit around in a circle and Charlie would kind of administer it like a sacrament. He'd place it on your tongue and go around the circle. I mean, it was special. And most of the trips were good, and then most of them were centered around music. I enjoyed his music. At that time, that, you know, a solo artist with his guitar was not that uncommon.
But by 1968, Charlie began to question whether his chances of making it in the music business may be improved if he had a band behind him. From the Spiral Staircase house and along Sunset Strip, Manson put the word out that he was forming a group and looking for young, gifted musicians. One of the first to turn up for an audition at the communal house near Topanga Beach was guitarist Ernest Knapp.
It was creepy right off the bat. He just had this sense about him that was just uncomfortable. Oddly, I didn't audition with the other musicians. I just auditioned for Charlie and his family. And I sat up in the middle of the living room floor, put my amp down and plugged it in. 3 of the girls had percussion instruments, shakers and a tambourine and some little drum, and actually were accompanying me. So, which I liked, you know, it was, I'll take any help I could get, you know.
Knapp was invited to join the band, and the following week returned to rehearse with Manson's quickly assembled ensemble.
Once we had some songs we knew we could play, so, okay, Charlie, what you got? And he performed his stuff for us. I thought he had talent, and I thought his songs were viable. It was more of a singer-songwriter type of presentation.
Naming the band the Milky Way, the following day they played their one and only public performance, an audition for the Saturday night slot at the local live bar, the Topanga Corral.
We all met down there and loaded up into a couple of cars and drove on up to the Corral, which at that time was a country western beer bar higher up in the canyon. But we were like probably one of the first hippie bands to try to play there. And this was in the afternoon, and there was the owner and a couple of guys sitting around, and they were not very nice about it and said no.
Manson's only ever band was Stillborn, and he refocused on his work as a solo artist. And despite its failure, the project had brought him into contact with another confident young musician, Bobby Beausoleil, who bragged about his affiliations to the band Love, and his late-night jam sessions with Frank Zappa would become a sporadic presence around the family over the coming 2 years.
He was more talented than Charlie. Everybody who saw the two of them together would agree. But Beausoleil, as a creative artist, certainly saw there was a lot of creativity in Charlie Manson, and there was a certain bond that was formed between them.
They shared a musical symmetry, they had a similar outlook. They complemented each other quite well. But Bobby Beausoleil was a strong male. He had his own independent mind. That's not something that really fitted in with Manson's family. So while they walked similar paths, Beausoleil was never a card-carrying member of the Manson family.
But he was well connected. As Manson was looking to move on from the Spiral Staircase, Beausoleil suggested the family head north into Topanga Canyon and move into an empty property where he had been staying in Horseshoe Drive. Here, in March 1968, the family were joined by Phil Kaufman, Manson's fellow inmate at Terminal Island, who was a free man once again.
When I got out in 1968, Gary Sternberg knew another guy I knew named Harold True. And Harold had been in contact with Charlie. So when I got out, Harold took me to Charlie. When I first met him after he got out, that wasn't the guy I knew in the yard singing The Shadow of Your Smile.
As impressed as he was by Manson's harem of women, Kaufman was also amazed at the transformation in his music. And in the compositions themselves, he could see how these new songs Charlie was writing were being used to seduce more followers.
He had a message. They have a meaning. They're kind of a Pied Piper meaning. Charlie went from Frankie Lane to kind of an acid music, you know. He was using it. It was a tool. Because the young people, younger than him, everybody's younger than him, were into the new music, so he put his lyrics to kind of a folky type, because he didn't have a band. And Look at Your Game Girl was the thing is, look at your game girl, come with me.
There's a time for living. The time keeps on flying. Think you're loving, baby.
Look at Your Game Girl is certainly the most complex of all of Manson's songs at that period. It's multi-layered. He harmonises with his guitar. It has different tempos. His voice range is considerable on that. So it's a very, and it's hard to say given, you know, what we know about Manson, but it's a very, very well-crafted piece of work.
Are those feelings real? Look at your game, girl. Look at your game, girl. What a mad...
I mean, it was a pitch man. I mean, he was selling something. He was selling him. And they bought it. These girls were lost. These children were lost. And the hippie thing, peace and love, that was his bait.
But the atmosphere in Topanga wasn't sinister. Peace and love reigned, and the family was beginning to experience Manson's conception of a communal life free from material concerns. With more new members joining the fold, he taught them how to live modestly, feeding themselves by visiting garbage dumps. Times were good, and these collective activities would find their way into the songs themselves.
You're not poor, you have a garbage dump. You'll never starve as long as you have a garbage dump. I mean, you buy a piece of cheese, it's dated today. You can't sell it tomorrow. But there's nothing wrong with it. You can take it home, put it in the fridge, or go home and eat it. And that's what Manson did, or I did. I was with him.
You know, at first it's like, ooh, you know, because some of the dumpsters were, you know, they're stinky. You know, they don't get cleaned, they don't get hosed out on a regular basis. But, you know, there was lots of cardboard in there, but there was also food. I mean, you know, some of them, you know, you'd learn when they threw the food out, you know, at what time, and so some of the stuff was still cold.
We were eating America's garbage, if you will.
When you're living on the road and you think sometimes you're starving, get on off that trip, my friend. Just get them cans and start carving. Oh, garbage dump, my garbage dump. Why are you called my garbage dump?
If you want to see who Charlie Manson would have wanted the world to see himself as, this is the image. Not the image of some monster who could make mindless robots go out and kill, but as a wonderful being who could exist on practically nothing and be richer than all the people who had all the things and might otherwise look down on him.
But although the atmosphere within the group was tranquil, for Phil Kaufman, Manson's constant sermonizing was becoming intolerable.
That got old, you know, that got old, and I got wiser. And fortunately, I got really wised up. You know, I saw the handwriting on the cell block. It was, you know, time to get out of there and divorce myself from him. The day I left, a friend of mine came pick me up, and he said, I gotta go, Charlie. He said, yeah, I know. You're still thinking, aren't you? I said, yeah, I'm gonna keep it up.
Sermons and communal activities may have filled their time, but Manson was also keen to make musical contacts. While he attempted to rub shoulders with the rock community living in and around Topanga Canyon, he also sent his followers to the Sunset Strip. Here they were to attract the attention of any musicians they may come across and effect an introduction to Manson. And in May 1968, two of the girls hit pay dirt.
Ella Jo Bailey, who is known as Yeller, and Pat Krenwinkel, walking down a road in Hollywood, hitching. Car stops to pick him up. A young, good-looking guy says, hey, do you girls need a ride? And he suggests that they go back to his place for milk and cookies. They think they know exactly what that means, but when they get back to his house, which is really a spectacular place, just off of Sunset, he really does offer them milk and cookies. And after a while, he says he's got a recording session, he's got to go. He hopes he sees them again sometime. He's in a band called the Beach Boys. They dutifully go back, and Charlie's asking, well, did you meet anybody? Did you meet anybody? Well, this one guy who's in the band picked us up and took us back to his house. You know, what band was he in? The Beach Boys. And Charlie, that's it. He is jumping out of his clothes. Where's this guy's house?
The Beach Boy they had unwittingly stumbled upon was Dennis Wilson, the drummer and younger brother of the band's celebrated producer and songwriter, Brian. That night, Manson and his entire family set off for Wilson's property on Sunset Boulevard, keen to make a real impression.
Dennis Wilson, middle of the night, coming back home, pulls into his driveway and the lights are on in his house. And there's a school bus parked there. There's people in his house. And he gets out of his car and he's going in carefully because he's a rich guy. You never know what's going to be there. And out comes this little short dude with a beard. You know, hey man, how are you? Acting like a host. And the first words out of Dennis's mouth are you going to hurt me? And Charlie Manson kneels down and he kisses Dennis Wilson's foot. Do I seem like somebody's going to hurt you, man? Come on in. And Dennis goes in, and there in his house is the Manson family making themselves at home.
With half-naked girls sprawled around his house, Dennis Wilson was instantly enchanted by Manson and his followers. Of all the Beach Boys, they had unwittingly met the one who would be most open to their charms.
Dennis Wilson was 100% different from all the guys in the rest of the band in one important way. He was the athlete. He was the guy who went out and surfed. And of course, the girls liked him the most. He was, very ruggedly handsome, and he had a way with women. The other guys, were sort of like Brian is tall and gawky, and Carl is like chubby and taking guitar lessons, and Al's going to be a dentist, and Mike's working at a gas station is sort of like the jerk lead singer, Dennis Wilson was the embodiment of what the Beach Boys were about. Their first songs were about surfing and cars. Brian Wilson was writing songs about Dennis's life.
And the family had burst into Wilson's life at a perfect juncture. In the past year, the Beach Boys had suffered a series of commercial disappointments, with their in-house genius Brian Wilson losing artistic control of the band and mentally struggling following his prolonged use of LSD. Trying to refresh their tired image in the new hip world, in the weeks before the Manson family arrived, Dennis had been on the road for a tour that paired the band with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. This prominent Indian guru had been elevated to superstardom following his involvement with the Beatles. Yet the combination of his speeches on transcendental meditation with a rock and roll show unsurprisingly failed to make any impact.
It was a disaster. I mean, the people that want to come see the Beach Boys don't want to see Maharishi, and the people who want to see Maharishi don't want to see the Beach Boys. It didn't work. Interesting idea, but it was a failure.
68 was a rough year for them. The Maharishi tour was a disaster. They had problems with the southern element of their tour because of the Martin Luther King assassination. They were losing money, they were hemorrhaging money. The records weren't selling. They really weren't catching up with people culturally. They were still wearing matching outfits on stage. So by 1968, I think that the Beach Boys were really perceived as part of the past.
But Dennis wasn't interested in being part of the past. A young man ever alive to new ideas, he had been fascinated by the Maharishi's teachings and was looking for greater meaning in his life. Manson's sermons denouncing material possessions and celebrating communal and spiritual unity, along with the sexual allure of the girls, won him over immediately, and he invited them all to join him at his 14400 Sunset Boulevard home.
Dennis was a fun guy. I remember him being kind of a wild man, though. He loved fast cars, fast women. He liked living in the fast lane. Dennis had just come off of like a retreat or something with the Maharishi Yogi. So I think Charlie kind of fit that guru. I think that Dennis was looking for this kind of inspiration.
Dennis was always looking for more. He was always looking for the next thing. And he was like a child in that way. And I think that these people really interested him. Part of the thing for Dennis at that time was that he harbored a certain amount of guilt for all that he had, for all of the wealth and all the trappings that came with it. I don't think he ever really felt like he deserved it. I think he felt like he got all of this basically because of his brother, and that all of this stuff just came to him not by his own hard work or not by his own talent, but just by luck.
And Wilson had only moved into his sprawling rented property on Sunset Boulevard recently, following the breakdown of his first marriage. With Manson and his wandering harem now permanent house guests, he contacted his close friend and collaborator, Greg Jacobson, and invited him to the party.
My first exposure to the wizard, as Dennis would call him, was he called me up one night and, Greg, you have to come down here, man. You got to see this guy. He's the wizard, and he's got all these girls. For me, it wasn't, yeah, okay, Dan, you know, I'd heard it before, girls in a party, and I'm married, I got a couple of kids. So I never responded until, you know, it was sometime maybe a week later when they were much more part of the whole scene down there at the house. I must say this, when Charlie was around, everybody knew it. He had an energy that you couldn't not pay attention to Charlie. He was a likable person. He was very charming, and he paid attention to you. I mean, I can understand why Dennis calls him the wizard, because he did have that unique ability to make you feel like he was concerned, you were important. You know, he didn't just shine you on.
Just living on that estate was magical. I remember, you know, getting high and drinking like orange juice or grape juice that was just, you know, heavenly.
Don't forget, Dennis had left his house and his family and his wife and stuff, and now he had all this literally adoration. And he had all these girls, they were making him clothes, and they almost would bow down to him. So I'm sure for the moment he was very charmed by the whole scene.
But it wasn't all about sex, drugs, and expanded consciousness. Wilson was also fascinated by Manson's music. And with his older brother Brian withdrawing from his role as the Beach Boys' driving force, the other band members were keen to find their own voice within the group, none more so than Dennis.
At the time he was developing his skills on the keyboard, he would come in the morning and practice and work things out, and sometimes Brian would help and show him things, but most of the time he was experimenting on his own. So he was different from the other guys who were familiar with chords and transitions and that kind of thing, you know. But he was extremely talented. He was a fast learner.
1968 was the first time that he was even being looked at as something that was serious musically. And Brian was allowing the others to show what they had, and Dennis was showing a knack for writing songs. He's a novice, but it's obvious that there's something there.
The Beach Boys had also recently set up their own record label, Brother Records, with an eye to signing new talent that would better reflect the times than their own stale act. Impressed by Manson's musical talents, Wilson hoped to both learn from and collaborate with his new house guest.
It was probably the first time that Dennis got interested in somebody and the music at the same time, almost like a producer would start considering how you deal with an artist. And I think that was where Dennis was coming from, and he realized that he really had something that he could bring to the table. And so he became musically Charlie's mentor, let's say.
Primarily, the relationship bound them together was music. What I remember is that he was truly fond of Charlie. I mean, he introduced Charlie to his friends, and Charlie was teaching him how to play the guitar, and he, you know, it was kind of a mutual admiration, a bromance or whatever. I mean, that's what I remember seeing, is that I think they genuinely liked each other.
It must have been a bit of a vindication for Manson to be taken seriously by somebody as well known as Dennis. Even though Dennis hadn't really developed himself as an artist yet, Dennis was a superstar. Suddenly you are collaborating with someone who is very well known and comes from a family that is hugely respected in the industry.
Along with Greg Jacobson, Wilson was also keen to introduce his dynamic new house guest and collaborator to another friend, record producer Terry Melcher. The son of Doris Day and the partner of rising star Candice Bergen, with his prominent role in the LA music scene, Melcher was a vital link between Hollywood past and present.
Terry Melcher was somebody who was very much part of the Hollywood entertainment scene, and he produced the first 2 Byrds albums, which are hugely important. He was very involved with Paul Revere and the Raiders, who were big hit makers at the time. I mean, everybody knew who Terry Melcher was. And so, to get his blessing or to summon his interest would have been a big get for any aspiring songwriter.
Over the coming months, Manson became close enough to Melcher that he was invited to the Beverly Hills property the producer rented in Cielo Drive. And although Melcher and Jacobson were his most frequent visitors, Dennis Wilson's home was a popular hangout for many prominent musicians.
Dennis's house was a gathering point. Being very liberal, people were felt welcome and could drop in at all hours. So many people called in on Dennis, and obviously collided with the Manson family. The likes of Stephen Stills, Glenn Campbell, Neil Diamond was another. Neil Young, freshly released from Buffalo Springfield, came across Manson, and he was blown away by Manson's musical playing. If reports are to be believed, he was enchanted with Manson. Actually bought him a motorcycle. Took him along to meet Mo Austin at Warner's, who, if accounts to be believed, wasn't that impressed. So I think Manson's personable presence enchanted people. The problem with Manson is once you bounce that down onto tape, it loses everything. So basically then what you're left with is some songs. You don't have Manson the character, you don't have Manson the girls. And I think that's what really enchanted people, was the package.
Now an accepted figure within the upper echelons of the LA counterculture, Manson's presence at parties and clubs became common. And in the very nerve center of the scene, on the Sunset Strip, and its premier venue, the Whiskey A Go-Go, he made an indelible impression.
There was an incident at the Whiskey one night. We were all there at the table. Charlie had come with us. Dennis was there. Terry Melcher was there. So we were all there, drinking beer and having a good time. And we noticed a bit of a commotion coming from the dance floor. And the Whiskey's packed. I mean, it's shoulder to shoulder. The girls are up in the cages at the time in the Whiskey, and the band is playing full on. The band is really into it because there's something going on. I stood up on the chair. I stood up in the back of the booth. And I said, hey, hey, you guys, you got to see this. And it was Charlie in the middle of the dance floor dancing, and he literally cleared the dance floor at the Whiskey. I mean, people slowly pulled back until, and I swear to God, to this day, it looked like electricity was coming out of him. I mean, that kind of energy. And he literally blew everybody away on the dance floor by himself. He wasn't, there's nobody could even come close to dancing with him. So, but that was Charlie. I mean, when he had that explosiveness, that energy.
Although he was making his mark on the scene, by the late summer, Manson and his family had outstayed their welcome at Dennis Wilson's house. In August, the Beach Boys were embarking on an extensive tour of the US and Canada to promote their latest album, and Wilson decided this would be the perfect time for his house guests to move on.
The party had to end sometime, and it was costing Dennis a fortune, and all accounts to be believed, it was $100,000 in food, gonorrhea treatment, lost clothing, everything. I mean, they were bleeding him dry.
I was told by Dennis, he says, hey man, I'm going on the road. Can you find us a new place? He says, I want my stuff out of there. Charlie didn't have much choice. I mean, the house got closed down. I closed it down while Dennis was gone. He came back a couple of weeks later to a new house.
Their friendship and musical collaboration continued, however, and Manson used the opportunity to relocate his growing family to a more isolated venue. Spahn Ranch, 30 miles north of Dennis's Santa Monica home, was a once thriving movie location during the heyday of Western films the previous decade. Now largely inactive, it proved perfect for Manson's needs.
Cult leaders can always be identified by a couple of things they do, and Manson did them all. The first thing is you have to find people who feel put upon, persecuted, and convince them that you know the way to protect them, but only you. It has to be me. The second thing you try to do is isolate them. You've got to get them away from outside voices, their own families, friends, media, anybody who would say, wait a minute, this guy's a crackpot. You want to get them to the point where the only voice they hear is yours. That's not going to work at Dennis Wilson's house. Spahn Ranch, just outside Los Angeles. And if you hear the distance involved, that it's not that many miles, you think, oh gee, it's just going to be smog and more big buildings. But it's actually sort of this natural area that seems like it's the frontier, it's the country, it's as far removed from big cities you can imagine, and yet it's only about a 25-minute drive. Charlie still can reach Los Angeles, but he can isolate his followers.
At Spahn Ranch, the family became a commune once again, and its reputation grew around Los Angeles. New followers found their way to this rustic idyll, along with members of biker gangs, the Straight Satans and the Satan's Slaves, and figures from the music world.
The Manson family's presence at Spahn's Ranch initially was like a psychedelic little house on the prairie. I mean, it was just a lovely throwback. You know, these guys were on an old film set and they were dressing up in costumes, and it was a happy-go-lucky scene. It was free love, free drugs, music, free food from the dumpster, and famous people were dropping in. You know, Dennis Wilson was there. He took the girls on a garbage dump drive, you know. It said Jim Morrison went there.
Whenever Terry and I showed up, or Dennis and I showed up out at the ranch, he would definitely have everything set up. In other words, when we were there, everybody was on alert and we were supposed to be entertained. I said, Terry, this should be filmed. We ought to film this thing. This is kind of history. This is really unusual. I mean, you have the girls, you have the horses, you have some cowboys, you have the hippies, you have the motorcycle gang, and you have this big movie ranch. Come on, I mean, you couldn't make that kind of stuff up. I thought, Terry, we should be filming this.
And while the family were acclimatizing to this new rural life, Dennis Wilson announced that the Beach Boys had agreed to record one of the songs that he and Manson had been working on earlier in the summer. This track, Cease to Exist, perfectly captured the cult leader's spiritual outlook.
Cease to exist. Just come and say you love me. Give up your world. Come on, you can't be. I'm your kind.
It was more Charlie's composition than Dennis's, because Charlie would really come from a different place. Charlie was much more philosophic, kind of the Eastern philosophy, and Dennis was fascinated with that to some degree. He could smell that there was something there, but he didn't know what it was. So he went along with that. He liked that. That was something new. And now the Beach Boys weren't writing about that kind of stuff either. They were still doing surf songs and good vibrations and so on, which was all cool. But this was a big departure. And it was very much the 60s, you know. This was new.
But as the band went into Brian Wilson's home studio to record the track in September 1968, they shaped the song into their own creation, and its name was altered to Never Learn Not to Love. Stephen Desper, the band's in-house engineer, oversaw the sessions.
We were all aware that Dennis had a friend named Charles Manson, and the two of them were both musicians, and as musicians do, they compare notes, they write things together. This was a collaboration, and Charles and Dennis had worked on it together. It may have been the initial idea, may have been Charles's, but he had given it to Dennis and been compensated for it. And the Beach Boys were taking it and embellishing it, as they do, and making it their own.
Come on, come on, who is that pretty girl? My life is yours, and you can have my world. I'm your kind, and I see. Never had a lesson I ever learned, and I know I could never learn not to love you.
Dennis, who knew his way around the studio and knew his way around vocal arrangements, took that idea and expanded it into something that was more palatable, that was pop. And again, for the Beach Boys, though, it was something that was pushing their sound forward.
Come in now closer. Come in closer. Closer, closer.
I think it's a really good song. I think it's better, actually, than it gets credit for. Harmonies are just gorgeous on that song. I think that the collaboration between Dennis and Manson really showed potential with this Never Learn Not to Love song. I think it definitely works. I think it's a win for the Beach Boys. And I think an album full of that kind of sound would have been amazing for them at the time.
Yet it was not to be. While the recordings should have provided the family with new hope, back at Spahn Ranch, the atmosphere was changing, and Manson's commune was losing its focus.
Things were getting a little bit more rougher. Everybody, I think, started pulling away because more and more we were hearing stories. The Satan slaves were now hanging out there. The picture was, the flower part was going away. It wasn't flowers and beads anymore. It was motorcycles and gasoline and harder core drugs and people coming from downtown LA that nobody knew. And winter was coming. It was kind of like the summer was, as the season was closing. It was getting darker earlier and so on.
And this reflected a darkness that had been spreading throughout the counterculture during 1968. The Summer of Love was now a distant memory. The Vietnam War continued to escalate. And following the assassinations of first Martin Luther King and then Robert Kennedy, the younger generation's faith in conventional political change was crushed. Across the nation, the counterculture took up arms and prepared for battle with the authorities, with violent clashes breaking out in several cities. At the same time, the peaceful civil rights movement was also transforming. And as riots erupted following King's assassination, Black Power became a new slogan for numerous groups looking to confront their white oppressors. And all of these currents fed directly into the mind of Charles Manson. Now his sermons altered, and his spiritual vision of a communal society was replaced by predictions of a coming apocalypse, a violent uprising in which African Americans would overthrow the existing order.
The ideas that Manson was playing around with, race war, revolution, the sense that everything was, falling apart. I mean, these were commonly thought ideas. Even at the point that Martin Luther King was assassinated, he had been outflanked on his left by more militant black political figures. So once he was shot and killed, there was the message of, you see where nonviolence gets you? The idea that the structure was under assault, couple that with the complicated, to say the very least, racial history of the United States. The sense that these forces were potentially in charge of a takeover, that again was something that was very much in the air.
But Manson took these common beliefs and warped them into a very singular vision. In September, aware that his control over his followers was slipping at the overpopulated Spahn Ranch, he scouted a new location for their commune deep in the heart of Death Valley. 200 miles north of Los Angeles, Barker Ranch offered total isolation, and he fed this into his prediction of the coming revolution. When the black population rose up to overthrow the white authorities, their commune would be hidden in this remote desert retreat, and when the dust settled, they would emerge to rule over a brave new world.
Times were different, It wasn't the same loving, commune kind of enlightenment thing anymore. There was an agenda. He'd always been kind of fostering and laying some groundwork for this race war. I think he truly believed that this was going to happen, and so he was always kind of preparing us. But the whole impetus was to make money, to get dune buggies and knives and guns or whatever and hide out in the desert until this war thing was over.
And just as music seemed to have receded into the background of the family's day-to-day existence, a record was released that shook Manson to his very core. Having sent a number of his followers to Death Valley to prepare their new accommodation in the desert, he and the remaining family members moved into a house on Gresham Street in the northern part of Los Angeles. And it was here that he first heard the Beatles' new LP, commonly known as the White Album. Through a number of its songs, somehow the Beatles were sending a message directly to Manson himself, confirming his prophecies of a violent race war.
When I came back from the desert to Gresham Street, and it was all this frenetic energy, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that Charlie felt like the White Album, the Beatles through the White Album were telling him that this black-white race war was Helter Skelter, it's coming down fast, you know, and he would play it backwards. He was obsessed, and I remember he made me stay and listen and pee my pants on the rug because he wouldn't let me leave to go to the bathroom. No, you stay here, I want you to hear this.
Have you seen the little piggies crawling in the dirt? And for all the little piggies, life is getting worse.
Piggies was one of the first he talked about, written by George Harrison, and George later said his mother actually suggested some of the lyrics that Charlie thought the Beatles were proclaiming, about how there were certain people that needed to be punished. What they need's a damn good whacking.
Harrison was just doing a dig at the upper classes, etc., etc. But of course Manson saw it as a call to arms. What they need's a damn good whacking. Piggies is certainly a violent song, and the word pig would play an important part in the Manson family's infamy later on.
Blackbird singing in the dead of night. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life you were only waiting for this moment to arise.
The song Blackbird, Charlie led his followers to believe was particularly significant. That although black people in Charlie's view were very inferior, they had been enslaved, they had been mistreated for so long, and now the Beatles were saying they were going to rise up. You were only waiting for your moment to arise. And then there's the real hook, Helter Skelter. In Britain, people would realize Paul McCartney is talking about an amusement park ride. But in America, nobody knew what a Helter Skelter was. And Charlie took advantage of that.
When I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the slide. Where I stop and I turn and I go for a ride. Till I get to the bottom and I see you again. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
When you get to the bottom, you go back to the top. That's the blacks. They're at the bottom. They're going to go to the top. Helter Skelter is the name the Beatles have given to the race war that's coming.
Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter.
Charlie bought into that because it's coming from the Beatles. This fit Charlie's predictions, and that was coming. That war, that black-white war was coming.
Life within the family radically shifted in the early months of 1969. For their exodus to the desert, they would need vehicles, gasoline, and weaponry, and Manson returned to his criminal ways to fund these new activities. But the musical dream was far from over. In March, Dennis Wilson reappeared with the offer of a demo session for Manson. The results would be presented to the Beach Boys themselves to see whether they would sign him to their new label, Brother Records. The recording would take place at Brian Wilson's home studio, with the band's engineer, Stephen Desper, in charge of the session. It was a remarkable opportunity.
Someone knocked on the studio door and says, your talent is here. So I met them at the front door. It was Charles, and he had with him 5 girls. He got his guitar out, and he had talent. I can see why Dennis wanted to do a demo with him and consider him as a talent that they would sign and produce. It was the producing part that bothered me. Once he got in front of the microphone and into the recording environment, he was not like other people. It was all very foreign to him, and he was annoyed by the whole thing. And I just wasn't feeling comfortable about being around him.
Charlie had his way of doing things, and he knew best. Being a rock star, a famous rock star, was not his highest priority. Because if it was his highest priority, to meet the Beach Boys, to record in their studio, yeah, what do you want me to wear? How would you like my hair, you know? Right?
After the first song, he came up in the control room and we made a playback. In the course of the playback, he pulled out a 6-inch switchblade and started cleaning his fingernails. I said to him, Charlie, you're going to have to take the knife out of the studio. And the reason for that was because it's Brian's house and he has family there. He has little girls upstairs. I don't know what this guy is, you know. Anyway, he called one of the girls and they took the knife out to the car, and then I had to go out and get them back in the studio, make sure they weren't wandering around the house and all that. But he liked what he had done and was satisfied with it. I guess he was there about 3 or 4 hours, pretty well into the evening.
Despite Manson's satisfaction with his performance, he had failed to win over Stephen Desper, whose job it was to report back to the band and their management.
I took the tapes to the office. They asked me how it went, and I said, well, he won't take direction. And I don't think he's going to be producible. But his songs are fairly good. I like the lyrics and so forth, and, you know, take a listen.
Brother Records were not interested, and although this news never fed directly to Charles Manson himself, he assumed from their silence that he was not going to be part of their roster. His attentions then turned to Terry Melcher, the producer who he had been socializing with since the previous year, and who was still an infrequent visitor to Spahn Ranch.
Charlie figures out when Dennis Wilson can't get him a record deal that, wait a minute, I miscalculated. The artists aren't high enough on the food chain themselves. And now he's got a different target in mind. That target is Terry Melcher. You have to remember that Manson has been trying to get Melcher to listen to him for over a year. And he's getting put off, and he's getting put off. And finally Melcher said, I will come out to Spahn Ranch, I will listen to you. He sets up a time and a date.
It raised everybody's hopes that we were going to make a record, you know, and earn some money. And really, at that point, the money was to go for gas and vehicles and food and supplies for the desert.
Terry Melcher has other things going on in his life. His mother's estate, I mean, there's problems going on, and he doesn't go. To him, well, so what? You know, I'll just call the guy up at some point and say, hey, sorry I couldn't make it last time. To Manson, it's not only a personal betrayal, but it threatens his hold on his followers, and he's furious. And he goes looking for Terry Melcher. And the first place he goes looking for Terry Melcher is the place that he knew Terry Melcher lived in, Cielo Drive, but Melcher's moved. He and Candace Bergen have gone to a place on the beach, a property that Doris Day owned. And now there's new folks renting. Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate.
Polanski and Tate were one of LA's most glamorous couples, representative of a new Hollywood that was embracing the counterculture. Polanski's European films earlier in the decade had brought him to international attention, and it was while working on the last of these, The Fearless Vampire Killers, that he cast and fell in love with Sharon Tate, the lead actress. Close friends of Terry Melcher and Candice Bergen, the couple had moved into the house on Cielo Drive in March 1969. And it was at the end of that month that Charles Manson came walking furiously up the driveway looking for Melcher.
Sharon Tate has a photographer, her personal photographer, who happens to be out there. And the guy sees, storming up the drive, this little scrubby-looking guy, looking kind of furious. What do you want? I'm looking for Terry Melcher. Well, this is the Polanski residence. You're in the wrong place. The owner lives out back. Manson says, I'll go see him. I'll just stay off the lawn, stay away from the main house. And he goes storming up, and the guy who owns the property says, oh, he's moved, and Charlie, I don't want you coming around again, without telling people you're on your way. And Manson is storming off, and as he's storming off, a beautiful woman walks out of the main house, and he looks at her for a minute, and then he storms away. Charlie Manson and Sharon Tate did look each other in the eye, very briefly.
When he was finally able to locate Terry Melcher, Manson rearranged their meeting, and on June 6, 1969, the producer traveled to Spahn Ranch to watch the 34-year-old ex-convict perform an elaborate set. It would take weeks before Manson was able to draw a response from Melcher as to whether he would be recommending him to Columbia Records. And it was not the response that he was hoping for.
Terry finally told Charlie, he said, hey, Charlie, I really appreciate your music. It's really good. But, it's just not my cup of tea. I don't know what I would do with you in the studio. And Charlie was heartbroken. I mean, he was crushed with that.
Charlie was really counting on it, and I think that he had his hopes up, and I think they encouraged it. I think that they should have been a little bit more upfront, in the beginning. But maybe they saw something in him, and I think Dennis did.
I think that was really a karate chop to the neck, boy, really. Because I know he was really thinking that he had a real in there. I mean, Terry was a record producer. This is what recording artists need, a record producer with a track record and a carte blanche to a big studio. Yeah, that's everything, if you're Charlie at that point. So yeah, that was crushing. I'm sure that was crushing to Charlie.
The events that tragically followed were fueled by this rejection and the desperation that was setting in through the family's chaotic activities. And as had been the case in his youth, Manson proved a hopeless criminal.
At this same time, Charlie's been warning about Helter Skelter, and we've got to get back to the desert. And the way he's getting money to buy the supplies they need is by doing drug deals. And among the people he's doing deals with, there's a music teacher named Gary Hinman that he knows, and there's a big black guy known as Lotsa Papa. And Lotsa Papa claims to be a Black Panther. And Hinman's talking about going to Europe, so that means Hinman's got some money. With Lotsa Papa, a drug deal goes wrong. Charlie, with a buntline special .22 pistol that he brought, shoots him and thinks he's killed him. Because he's killed Lotsa Papa, suddenly becomes convinced that the Black Panthers are going to be coming after Manson in the family. And Charlie may have talked about racial apocalypse and everything else and was exaggerating, but Charlie was scared shitless of the Black Panthers.
That disastrous drug deal in July 1969 was followed by an even worse event at the close of the month. The family's sometime cohort, Bobby Beausoleil, was running a drug deal involving his Topanga Canyon supplier, the musician Gary Hinman, and the motorcycle gang the Straight Satans, who were frequent guests at Spahn Ranch. When the bikers accused Beausoleil of ripping them off with inferior product, he and 3 members of the family visited Hinman to get their money back. But a fight ensued. The event spiraled out of control, and after 2 days in his apartment, Bobby Beausoleil murdered Hinman, scrawling messages in the musician's blood across the apartment walls. It took the police only 2 weeks to apprehend the murderer.
The death of Gary Hinman, which involved several members of the Manson family and principally Bobby Beausoleil, who was not a card-carrying member of the Manson family, but was certainly closely allied in many ways, at this point also to drug dealing with the Manson family. Ultimately, and if who we are to believe, but apparently, allegedly, Manson had said to Beausoleil, you know what to do, which led to Hinman's death. Beausoleil spinning out of control is picked up very soon, and with blood all over him, it led back to the murders, and Beausoleil is arrested. Manson's prison house would say, well, you know, this is gonna come back to me. He might not have said, you know, what to do, but certainly the strands are all running back. The drug deal was conducted from Spahn's ranch, possibly facilitated by Manson. It was certainly all going to lead back to him.
Fearful that he would be caught up in the Beausoleil case, Manson declared that the time for Helter Skelter had come and sent 4 of his followers into the Los Angeles night to commit a copycat murder, led by 24-year-old Tex Watson. There were 2 objectives. Firstly, that new crimes would lead the police to assume that Beausoleil was innocent and that the killer was still on the loose. And secondly, that the police would target African Americans for the murders and thus set the race war in motion. And looking for high-profile targets, Manson sent his hunting party to Terry Melcher's old residence on Cielo Drive.
It was location. He needed to kill famous people and try to make it look like the Panthers had done it to get the heat off Bobby Beausoleil. The place that he was most familiar with, where rich, famous people had to live, was Cielo. If somebody lived where Melcher had lived, that was somebody important. The second critical thing, why that location was chosen, Tex Watson, besides Charlie, had been to the house on Cielo and theoretically knew how to get there from Spahn Ranch. That's why they picked that house.
The murders that occurred on August 8, 1969 were amongst the most brutal crimes of the era. Sharon Tate and her 3 house guests slain without any remorse. And the following night, the killing spree continued, with wealthy middle-class couple Rosemary and Lino LaBianca suffering a similarly violent demise.
Another savage night of killing, but interestingly, in terms of the musical aspect, this is the night when they decided to daub Death to Pigs. The night before, they put Pig on a door, again referencing back to the Beatles. The key motif that night was Helter Skelter written on the fridge door. I have my own feelings that why the killings stopped at that point, certainly those sort of killings, is that when they went back to Spahn's ranch and Manson would debrief them of what had gone on, when he heard that Patricia Krenwinkel had written Helter Skelter in blood on the fridge door, he freaked. Everyone knew about Manson's Helter Skelter theories, obsessions. There was even a nightclub at Spahn's ranch called the Helter Skelter. So I think that's when Manson spooked fully, and that's when the move to Barker Ranch occurred.
But Manson was still short of cash. No longer worried about his relationships in the music industry, he decided he was still owed money for the Beach Boys' recording of Cease to Exist, whose lyrics Dennis had changed without even asking his permission. He set out across LA to hunt for the drummer, and eventually found him with Greg Jacobson and the Beach Boys' photographer, Ed Roach.
It was just after the Woodstock Festival started, so I know it was like a week or 2 after the Cielo Drive episode, and he came in and he just jumped into the room, and he looked just like he looked in the newspapers, where his hair was just like standing, and he jumped in and he said, "I just come from the moon," and I went, "Holy shit, this is that guy Charlie," and Charlie said, "I need to talk with you," and he took him outside. And Dennis came back in, walked in, grabbed the guitar and walked out, came back in without the guitar, and he said, "I had to give him all my money and that guitar," or he said he was gonna kidnap my son in the morning and kill him. And that was over the song.
It was the end of the relationship and the end of Manson's connections to the LA music scene. The following week, he and his followers jumped into their dune buggies and set out on the road, heading for the desert. And while the Los Angeles police force struggled to make headway in the investigations of either the Tate or LaBianca murders, in Death Valley, this newly arrived commune soon sparked the interest of the local law enforcement. In October, across 2 raids, the police arrested the Manson family, having discovered their fleet of stolen dune buggies. Charles Manson and some of the murderers were taken into custody, albeit on far less serious charges. And while waiting in a detention center, family member Susan Atkins, a participant in both home invasions, began bragging about the murders to a fellow inmate. It was the lead the investigation needed, connecting the various strands of the story and interrogating Manson's followers. The LAPD and the district attorney soon were confident they'd found the murderers, and they called a press conference on December 1st, 1969, to announce that the case was solved. Charles Manson and his family became instantly infamous.
My personal reaction was kind of disbelief at first, because he didn't seem that bad. He was a little weird, but I didn't think he was capable, and I didn't think those girls out there in the studio were capable of stabbing people.
When I read about it, I was nervous. So, you know, what, I was shocked, you know. I didn't believe it at first. The girls, I couldn't believe how they had changed. I mean, they went out there and slaughtered people. They're not, look at your game, girl. Give it up, give me up all your love. They're out there and viciously killed people.
I was at home, I mean, somebody called me up, hey, have you heard what happened? And when I was told that, I thought for a second, I said, that's real, that really happened. I wasn't surprised even a little bit. It all made sense to me that it had gotten that far out of balance, that far out of control.
Within the music world itself, panic quickly spread. Although Manson and the murderers were behind bars, many of the extended family were still free. Convinced that he was the true target of the attack at Cielo Drive, Terry Melcher in particular was anxious, while those who had been involved with Manson in any way looked to protect their reputations and distance themselves from the story.
Terry went and bought a riot gun, you know, a 12-gauge shotgun, that kind of with a shot-off shot barrel, and you has like 6 shells in it. He literally kept it by his front door. Yeah, they were very concerned. Dennis a little bit less, but Dennis would more laugh it off. But Terry was, yeah. Oh no, Terry took it seriously. He didn't know what those people were capable of, and he wasn't going to take a chance.
I got a call from Beach Boy management. They told me they were going to take the tapes and put them in a safe place. And they want to make sure there were no copies or anything like that. Dennis was off to a non-disclosed area. Nobody knew really where he was, but there was a sense that Dennis was threatened.
It didn't satisfy him at all that Charlie was in jail, that he wasn't in danger anymore. Dennis's whole personality changed. He wasn't at all the same person. There was a paranoia about him, the fear of how close he was to it all.
And as the district attorney prosecuting the case, Vincent Bugliosi, began to look for witnesses to call upon during the trial, he found those close to Manson in the entertainment world were unwilling to tarnish their reputations by taking the stand.
Dennis was not going to cooperate with Bugliosi, and neither was Terry. I, to this day, believe Terry made a deal with Bugliosi. What it was, I don't know. Because Bugliosi wanted to bring Dennis into court, I mean, a Beach Boy. He wanted to bring Candace Bergen into court, Terry's girlfriend. So, I mean, that couldn't happen in Terry's world. And he did everything possible to stay as far away from it. And Dennis, the same thing. Where I just, okay, I was there, I'll tell you what, so I cooperated. I wasn't telling any lies, and I didn't see anything criminal happen, so I wasn't saying, oh yeah, I saw the gun or something. I just told the truth.
Manson, meanwhile, was trying to keep control of his followers from the inside and was eager to generate some income that would help him do this. Now that he was on the front pages across the world, he decided that this was the perfect time to release a record, the rock star dream refusing to die.
Manson felt that the tapes from Brian Wilson's house were brilliant music. If this was going to be his only chance to get a musical statement out, he liked that idea. Also, he had legal expenses, not just for himself, but for the women in the trial. He desperately had to make sure that they were going to stay loyal to him. Their lawyers all wanted to separate their cases from Manson so that they could claim, well, the women were just fooled by this man. Charlie needed to keep everybody happy. Charlie had to get money, and what better way to do it, he thought, than finally releasing this great album of his that simultaneously would make him a rock star, and at the same time that covers all the legal fees.
Manson enlisted Lynette Fromm, known within the family as Squeaky, to make this happen. And although she discovered that the recordings from Brian Wilson's studio were under lock and key, she convinced Greg Jacobson to release tapes from a session he had arranged at Sound City Studios in mid-1968. She then called Phil Kaufman to aid her in the release of the record, and Kaufman, who at this time believed Manson must be innocent, agreed to help.
Lynette Squeaky contacted me. We got to get Charlie's music out. Because somehow he thought that the album would people hear the music, they would understand that what he was doing was valuable. She got the tapes. They had 1/4-inch tape, and I took it into a studio and we cleaned it up. We did the mix down. I got some people to chip in some money to put it out, and we made 300 copies. It was the Life magazine cover, which we dropped the F out of Life, and it became The Lie. It's a lie. He's innocent. How could you listen to his music? How could you charge him with such a thing?
Clang, bang, clang, went the big iron door. They put me in a cell with a concrete floor. 9 other men in that cell with me, moaning their fate with destiny. Clang, bang, clang.
This is here the album. This is one of the original albums, and you can tell it's original by the yellow label. Anything else is a bootleg. So he asked me to get the album out, and I did. And to this day, I really regret it, my association. But you can't divorce yourself from the past.
The record, upon its release, received none of the success that Manson felt it deserved, and even his infamy failed to shift any copies.
Manson's career as a musician, I think, was of little consequence to people looking at the headlines at that time. I think they saw him more as a cult leader than a musician. And equally, when they heard the music, it's difficult to marry that to the carnage that went on and the horror. So a curio at best, hugely distasteful, actually what most people thought of it. No record company would touch it of any note, and it was not going to get any radio play. It's just another example of Manson's innocent stroke hopelessness, that he'd actually imagined that actually anyone would want to buy this.
As the Manson trial became an all-consuming media circus, the counterculture itself struggled to deal with this cult leader and his hippie credentials. As the crusade against the ideals of this movement had been emboldened first by Californian Governor Ronald Reagan and then incumbent President Richard Nixon, conservative American values were proving more robust than the counterculture had once believed. While some tried to politicize the Tate LaBianca murders and unwisely held Manson up as a revolutionary leader, most simply acknowledged that these desperate, shocking acts had forever tarnished a movement extolling peace and love.
I don't think by design Charles Manson arrived to destroy the hippie dream, but by God he did. And people have said that from the moment in December 1969 that Manson was on the front of the newspapers, anyone resembling a hippie was demonized.
If you were, somebody on the right who just detested everything that the counterculture stood for, you couldn't have scripted Charles Manson and those heinous murders any better. It gave the right every weapon it could use. I mean, there was sex, there was drugs, there was violence, the Beatles are in there, all of it. It just handed it to the right.
The part of the human spirit that is more tolerant and open and trusting and less fearful is one of our superpowers, really. But of course, you set yourself up sometimes. And I think that was one of the real shocks of Manson, that we, much like the Hells Angels at Altamont, in some cases we made friends with the wrong people.
And for many of those who had befriended Charles Manson, he would remain a permanent presence in their life. While he became an exaggerated villain in popular culture, a crazed maniac and psychotic mastermind, for some, drawn into his musical journey, he was a real and complex figure, and their association with him left lifelong damage. Having placed such faith in the man he called the Wizard, after the shocking news of the murders emerged, Dennis Wilson was cast adrift. The once vital soul of the Beach Boys was left haunted by a friendship he could never erase, and over time he lost himself in drink and drugs. He died in 1983, aged only 39, and had refused since Manson's arrest to ever discuss the affair in public.
He never brought it up, and I didn't think it was my place to bring it up, so Dennis never spoke about this. I'm sure he felt responsible to some extent. I mean, he was highly involved in it. It was all mixed up in it, you know.
Dennis never really spoke about the murders. He would reflect sometimes back on his experiences with the family more, but never, I don't know how much he actually, you know, I mean, he really did kind of avoid the whole massacre aspect of it.
Dennis never really recovered from it, from the emotional hit that he took from it. Dennis was already the black sheep of the band. And, you know, this just basically, just as he was starting to grow out of that and become something that people were taking artistically, seriously artistically, this happened. And it just, you know, basically stamped him as the loser forever. I think that he thought of himself that way. I think it was a battle for people to convince him that he was more than that. And I just think that it followed him